Let's face it, Excel is a fantastic tool for building and showing reports. Most of the time, however, it's analyzing data from some other system or application. So when we build a pivot table that everyone loves, we're going to need a way to keep it up to date when we have new data coming in. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about a few different ways to refresh your pivot table when new information is available. So to start off, let's just address the simplest case of data changing. Now, normally we've recommended to keep your pivot tables on a separate table without the raw data, but just for this example of showing you how to refresh a pivot table, we've got the data in columns A through E and the pivot table in G through I. Notice a couple of these values. Look at the items sold for Brooklyn cakes. We've got 20 items sold on Tuesday, May 5th. If you look over our pivot table, that indeed says 20. And now if we also look at croissants for that same entry, we've got number of items sold is 5. Same as our pivot table. Everything's good so far. So let's go ahead and change these items. Let's change the items sold to, let's say 30. Cakes and croissants, let's change it to 25. Now if you notice, our pivot table didn't change at all. We still got the values of 20 and 5. In almost every other Excel function or formula that you write or tool, it automatically updates everything. Pivot tables don't. For this example, it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's small. But a lot of times pivot tables pre-calculate all the possible permutations of the metrics in the data area. And so Excel really wants you only to refresh the data when you know that it needs refreshing. So to do that, I can click on my pivot table, go to my pivot table tab, and you see at the end here is a refresh button. I can just click that and say refresh. And it refreshed all the data there. And that's the same thing. If you get more advanced in the pivot tables, you might see how to attach the pivot table to an actual database table. In that case, you really will need to go up and hit the refresh command. You can also do that by right-clicking and just go to refresh data. It is pretty common, but it's important to note that just changing the data doesn't update the pivot table. Now, right now, we just have a pivot table that shows all the products sold, and the column labels are cities. We just have Brooklyn. So the next case that we want to do is we want to add the Manhattan data to that pivot table. Well, that's easy enough. Let's just put it close together because Excel likes that, right? So I'll drag it up here, remove that break. Didn't work. What about trying to refresh? That didn't work either. If you add more rows of data to your table, you're going to have to go and actually redefine that data source. So let's go to our pivot table and go to our pivot table tab, and then we want to go down to change source. Now this is pretty neat because it comes up with a location dialog box. It says right now we're looking at A3 through E10. We could type in that now we want it to go to E17, or if we're on this reference editor box, you see how we get the marquee around the data that it's now looking at? We could just expand that to go all the way to the end of our data. Again, we could type that number in ourselves if we knew what it was, if we went down to 1,000, whatever we want. But we have to do that when we add rows to our pivot table. Now we click OK. And now you see all the Manhattan numbers got added in. So let's do one more thing. We've got the data right here for a small group of bakeries. Now let's look at another tab here, Data NY Bakery. Notice we've got location, item, cost per item, item sold, and day as column headings. We have the same headings here in our data for NY Bakery. Location, item, cost per item, item sold, and day. But we have many more rows. We've got 129. Another thing about this is this table actually has a named range. Table NY Bakery. Highlighted that whole table. So let's go back to our pivot table now. And let's go back to our change data source. And let's just type in table NY Bakery, because that's what we named that table in another tab. And now this data is tied to a completely different tab. As long as the column headings were the same, Excel could build that pivot table off of that data. So now you see we've got completely out of whack totals, but that's because they're looking back at the original tab that has the NY Bakery data on it. So the last tip to give you again is that when you're changing the data source in a pivot table, if you use a named range and that table expands, you won't have to rechange the source. You'll still have to do the refresh if data changes. But if you use just a regular cell reference, you will have to go and change the source anytime you add new rows to your data. So we've seen here that refreshing data on a pivot table is a pretty important aspect of reporting, and it needs to be addressed, but it's really pretty simple. There are also ways to completely automate the updating of a pivot table with pretty simple macro or VBA code. Just keep that in mind when you're building reports that need to be refreshed periodically.